Hello, I'm Dr. Daniel Griffin.
And I'm Dixon Dupommier.
And today we're going to be discussing chronic pulmonary disease. So that's going to cover COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and asthma.
All right.
Now, we often think of smokers, but you and I were talking a little bit earlier about some other inhalation exposures where people end up with chronic lung disease.
When you consider that most of the rural world, I should say, is living off the land, and a lot of those areas of the world don't have access to fossil fuels like coal or oil or natural gas, and they still have to eat. They burn things, and mostly they burn what they can find. I know this is not true for people that live, let's say, in Mongolia and on the steppes of southern Russia and places like that. But if you look to East Africa rather, in places like Kenya and Ethiopia and even into Tanzania, people cook, obviously, and they use wood in their fires, and they do it in many other places as well. And one of the big issues about rural health is smoke inhalation. Mm-hmm. And that in the wintertime, I'm going to tell you that occurs also in the yurts, in the steppes. So they burn fuel, but they only burn it when they have to. So that results in a worldwide dilemma of what do you do about this? How do you solve that problem? Because these people are traditionally oriented towards the way of doing lifestyle things that relate to collecting wood. The labor is divided among the family members. The cooking is mostly done by women, but not only by women. And the men are out hunting something for the women to cook. And the next thing you know, they spend all day long over these fires, and it creates a problem.
You know, the issue, so I'm going to break this down and say that when we worry about chronic lung disease, we're worried about breathing in things that may damage the lungs. So certain types of indoor cooking, so indoor air pollution generated by that, certain occupational exposures, tobacco, these are some of the big three. Right. And it's enough of a problem that the World Health Organization has listed indoor air pollution from indoor cooking as one of the major threats that they want to try to address.
Right.
And it's an issue throughout the world. It's an issue in the highlands of Nepal. It's an issue in India. It's an issue in Africa. It's
in Mexico City.
Anywhere that, I'm trying to figure out where in the world is there no indoor or outdoor air pollution.
That's right.
I mean, it's a problem in our cities.
Yes.
It's a problem in our rural areas.
Sure.
It's a problem either because we're generating, because we're trying to cook our food. And there's a lot of initiatives to create ways of doing indoor cooking. There's a lot of effort to try to decrease outdoor pollution. And there's a huge effort to try to decrease tobacco smoking.
Oh, no question.
And so I think it's important to realize that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is more than just a smoker's cough. It's not just a nagging thing, it's something that generates significant disability.
And not only that, these are in combination. So you could have someone suffering from smoke inhalation from cooking that also smokes.
That is true.
So you've got these multiplicities of effects that eventually end up shortening a person's life, taking away from their enjoyment of what's left of their life. Mm-hmm. And it's a tragic situation that can be avoided.
Yeah. And we've been talking a bit about COPD, the chronic obstructive, but there's also people that have more of a genetic inflammatory lung disease, or asthma, where there's a reversible component. Something triggers it, and the airways are going to acutely constrict down. Yep. And in certain areas of the world, there's been an exponential rise, not only in the frequency of that disease, but also in mortality, in deaths from asthma.
Yes. I was once a participant in a state health fair. The state happened to be North Carolina, and I can remember distinctly one of the presentations at this 2-day meeting that was held in Raleigh. There are two routes that go through North Carolina. One goes north-south, the other goes east-west. And they mapped out the acquisition of asthma in school children. And they mapped it by the number of days that they were absent and the number of hospital admits. And these two factors together were associated with heavy automobile traffic. And they discovered that there was an element of exhaust ozone which triggered their asthmatic attack. And the whole program was geared towards trying to get people to move away from these two highway systems, that the closer you moved to them to gain access to the freeways, the more likely it was that your children developed asthma as school children.
Yeah.
And of course, they were dumbfounded at first as to what the cause was, but it turned out to be ozone, surface ozone, not atmospheric ozone. At the surface.
So the asthma, I think, as you point out, it all ties together
Yeah.
because these are major public health problems.
Absolutely.
Is dealing with different styles of cooking that might help with the indoor air pollution.
Sure.
I think community and global level, what can we do about outdoor air pollution? What we can do despite the capitalist-driven tobacco distribution industry.
North Carolina, did you say?
I think you mentioned North
where
Carolina.
most tobacco comes from North Carolina, I must tell you.
But let's jump in because we have a lot to cover with COPD and not as much time as I think I would like, but there are certain criteria for making the diagnosis of obstructive lung disease. And the first distinction I'm going to make is between reversible, which would be our asthma, and our fixed or non-reversible obstructive lung disease. And there's going to be two approaches to doing this. One is going to require a little bit of technology, which I'm going to encourage people to think about having in their clinics, and that is something called a spirometer. And there is a global initiative for chronic obstructive lung disease, and they've developed what they call the GOLD criteria for the diagnosis. And this is based upon a device called a spirometer. And what you do is you take a very deep breath, and then you use this device, and you breathe out. And the amount of breath that you can get out in that first second, the forced expiratory volume in the first second, can be used as a criteria for not only making diagnosis, but judging the severity of your COPD.
Oh, wow.
So I'm going to encourage clinicians who are going to be trying to address this to have that technology available. Now, the British Medical Research Council has realized that not everywhere do they have spirometers. So what do you do? Is there a symptom-based way of making the diagnosis and managing it? So let's go through the two different approaches. So the GOLD approach is going to be much easier. It's a 1 to 4 scale, and it's based upon this forced expiratory volume in that first second. So FEV1 is what it's called. And your mild, your just introduction to disease, is going to be when that falls below about 80% of what's predicted.
Right.
So that'd be your mild or GOLD stage 1. Those of you who are watching, you'll see now the GOLD stage. You can follow along as we go through this. GOLD stage 2 is when we start to get moderate. And this is when our FEV drops below that 80%, but is still above 50%. We get to our GOLD stage 3, and this is where you're starting to get into severe. And this is going to be between 30 and 50%. And then our very severe or GOLD stage 4 is going to be less than 30%. Now this translates, and maybe you can think about it making more sense on the impact on life if you think about the modified British criteria, so the MMRC. And here we also have the same 4 steps, but now it's symptom-based. So our grade 0, basically before you have any issue, is going to be you can do whatever you want. But now you get grade 1. And grade 1 is when you're trying to walk on level ground and you're starting to get short of breath, or there's a little bit of an incline and you're starting to notice it.
Right.
When you get to grade 2, you might be with a group of people. You have to walk a little bit more slowly. You can't keep up with people. When you get to grade 3, this is when you're actually going to have to stop and start taking breaks.
Dear, dear.
Not only are you going more slowly, but you're not able to do it. And this is going to happen with just a few minutes on level ground. You need to take a break.
Is this age dependent?
Well, the grading isn't. They don't adjust it for
They
age,
don't.
which is interesting for people who might have a foot drop or another visual impairment. Because ultimately, this is you're limited by your breathing. And the person says, "Oh, I need to stop," but it's because my back hurts.
That's different.
And so 4, and this would be the most severe, this is when your breathing becomes so limited that you have trouble leaving the home or even performing activities of daily life. You get exhausted and short of breath trying to get dressed or undressed.
Yeah,
And so I encourage clinicians to have a spirometer, but I don't want to marry you to that. So, if you don't have spirometry, we do have a symptom-based way of grading and monitoring treatment.
right.
What about treatment? Do you have any friends or colleagues who are smokers who may be walking around with oxygen or breathing treatments?
Unfortunately, my father was a smoker, but he died of a heart attack way before he developed any of these chronic syndromes. So I'm sorry to say he didn't live long enough to develop them, but I'm not sure how he would have done anyway. But I've seen a lot of elderly people that are compromised.
Yeah.
And wheelchair-ridden or bedridden even, without being able to get out of bed, that have oxygen next to them, of course, and it's a very sad situation to see.
No, I think what you bring up is a lot of people with lung disease may actually die of another cause because a lot of the damage that you're seeing to the lungs, they're also at risk of heart disease.
Very true.
So those people who continue to suffer from this, one of the things I bring up is oxygen. Oxygen is a pretty resource-intensive intervention, but it is one of the life-saving. People who are getting below a certain percent, 88% with their oxygen, with oxygen added, you can increase their lifespan, you can decrease the number of deaths. But again, think about the resources involved in that. That's not something that's available to everyone in the world.
No.
There are certain symptomatic things that we can do. We have a number of inhalers.
Yes.
And some of the inhalers are we call beta agonists. They're short-acting or long-acting where they open up the airways. We might have inhalers that have corticosteroids or anti-inflammatory agents.
Right.
And we have a number of charts that list different treatments, different recommendations. A couple things I want to reinforce. One is it's actually not that easy to deliver the medicine to the airways. And I remember during my training, there was actually an MD that is training with me, and they had asthma, and they had an inhaler, and the attendings, the senior physician asked them, "Oh, can you demonstrate to the group how to use your inhaler?" And lo and behold, did they use it properly? No. Basically put it right in their mouth, sprayed it into the back of their throat, and then breathed in air. And so it is not that easy to use, and so a lot of times we recommend the introduction of something called a spacer. And a spacer is a chamber between the inhaler and your mouth where the medicine can be sprayed in and then breathed into the lungs. And these don't need to be complicated. These can be made out of old toilet paper rolls or any other things that might be around where you're creating a chamber, old cups you might use, for instance.
So you length of bamboo, if you're in a rural
if it was,
area?
if you had a fat piece of, so whatever you can think of that might be in the area. So I'm going to recommend, not only do I want everyone to get spirometers for their clinics, but I'm going to say be creative. If you're going to give these medicines, let's make sure they get delivered.
There you go.
So I'm going to encourage people to use spacers.
Right.
But let's break down a little the treatment of asthma versus the treatment of COPD.
Complicated.
Asthma, we like to point out, is primarily an inflammatory disease.
Right.
So if they're using their rescue inhalers more than once a week, you want to start thinking about ways to treat the inflammation, but you want to be careful. If it's delivered to the mouth, they're going to end up with horrible thrush infections, so it's not without risk to be encouraging someone to use an inhaled corticosteroids. If it's a COPD, the steroids are going to play less of a role. So again, you always want to be thinking about the risk-benefit. If you're having them use one of the corticosteroid inhalers, often have them rinse the mouth out well afterwards. That can be quite something because a lot of these areas there's not a lot of water.
That's true.
So you're going to be wasting your cup of water a day rinsing your mouth out from your inhaled.
Very true.
In some of the more severe exacerbations, we might actually use oral steroids. We might give them prednisone to take pills. What about antibiotics? Should we give them antibiotics?
Well, if they don't have an infectious disease, I'm not sure why you're doing that, actually.
Yeah, so particularly with asthma exacerbations, very rare that antibiotics are going to benefit us. Certain situations with COPD exacerbations,
Yeah.
there can be a benefit to antibiotics. So that would be one of those situations where someone with a long history of COPD comes in what presents as a URI, a bronchitis. This might be one of the exceptions to the rule where antibiotics might play a role. So we talk a little bit about doxycycline, which may also have an anti-inflammatory property. Maybe some of our sulfur-based medicines may have less of a general impact on the flora, but there can, in certain situations, be a role for antibiotics here. But I think the big thing comes back to the stuff we talked about in the beginning.
Yeah.
Is prevention.
That's right.
You may be going to these areas and the patients are in front of you, you're thinking in that picture, but a big thing is to think a little bit larger. When this person leaves your clinic, are they going back to cook with wood and other stuff in the corner of their hut, and then they're going to breathe in?
Do they have a choice?
Are they a smoker?
Right.
And with the, do you go to their place and you say, is there a way to ventilate your cooking area a little bit better?
Well, I've seen a lot of clever attempts to change the way they cook, and one of them is called a solar cooker, which in some countries, like tropical and subtropical countries where there's a lot of sunshine usually, but that's seasonal too, but let's assume that they have access to the sun. There's no cooking whatsoever by burning anything. It's merely concentrating the rays of the sun onto the food. It's more difficult to retrain someone whose traditional values say, no, we have to collect wood because it's part of a family activity or something of this sort. But if we could convince them that, look, it's fine to do that, but look what you get as a result. Your mother died at a young age, your grandmother died, you don't want to end up the same way. So here's an alternative. I know electric cookers, in modern societies.
If you have access,
But we're seeing more and more installation of solar panels in rural areas. And the reason for that, it relates more to this than it does to COPD. It relates to, what are you going to do in the evening after the sun goes down? You can read if you have glasses and an electric light.
And that's an interesting issue. We ran into an issue in Nepal where a lot of the people are using the cooking as a light source in the home. So there was an introduction of cleaner burning fuel cooking approaches. But the people were then left with, well, how do I light my home?
Of course.
And there also was a visual of when you can see the fire, it makes sense that the food is cooking, but the idea of something getting hot without the light. So there can be cultural barriers.
Exactly.
And I use Nepal as an example, but let's talk about smoking in the United States, Western Europe, parts of China. It's easy to look at another culture and say, oh, a little education.
No,
but
that's right. No,
a lot of
it's more than
education
that.
doesn't even make a difference a lot of
That's
times.
right. So I want to follow up on the idea that I just said before, because the sun doesn't actually shine at night, so solar panels aren't going to work that way. What they're going to do is charge a battery. And the battery then is used to light the light and keep that lit long enough for the kids to do their reading or the parents to do their reading. And you've got 3 or 4 more hours of artificial sunlight basically through that.
Yeah, so but I've seen some of these solar cookers and they're
remarkable. I mean, they're cleverly designed. They're not expensive for the most part, but they do cost something.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about mosquito netting and this sort of thing as an expense, it's hard to imagine, other than volunteer programs where they're given away, how this could actually work. Communal cooking might be one answer for that. Make large solar cookers and have groups of people cook their same meal together.
Yeah.
So that could, and then just take it back. I don't know.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot of global health challenges here.
There are many.
And there's definitely a lot of challenges to the individual patient. So.
You bet.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us again for what I feel like is a pretty complex area.
Very complex.
But hopefully we've given people a little bit of a foundation to start thinking about this and start working towards a solution.
Yep. See you next time.